Well, good morning. I just thought I'd stand up from my drawing board here, working actually on some really cool stuff here with our amazing projects at Tiki Farm. I've actually got a Sven project on my drawing board that I'm doing some digital sculpting of a piece. But I'm waiting for the computer to be able to save some files, and so I thought I'd take a quick little break here and do another little quick drawing lesson for you guys. So let's get started. Okay, now remember that the essence of these drawing classes that I'm doing, these short little lessons, these free lessons, just to get you interested in drawing, even for those who have never drawn before, are to be able to start with things where you're not making a major investment on materials or anything like that. So thinking of that, I thought, okay, let me show some of you guys some things you can do with a what I call a tone paper. A tone paper can be, in this case, I took the backside of a bag, a brown paper bag. I just cut a brown paper bag open and ironed it a little bit, and took two of them actually, so that I could work on materials that just about anyone would have. And I have some pastels. They're called, the company's name is called NU-Pastels, New Pastels. But I'm certainly not endorsing them as the only source. They're a hard pastel as opposed to a soft that is more blendable and used for softer portraits and things. But these are great to sketch with. You can also sketch with Conte crayons or different things like that. But the reason these are really good on tone paper is you can think just a little bit with some highlighting and lights, and I'm going to show you a couple of things that I think you'll get a kick out of. So when you get a chance, get yourself a brown paper bag, cut it in half, and see if you can pick up some of these pastels or colored pencils, maybe a white and a black colored pencil, Prismacolor, or Prismacolor is a great colored pencil to use, or these pastels. These pastels are very fun to play around with. You get your hands dirty, and then you end up looking like me. But by the way, I looked at some of these demos, and I need to get some of the clay and things off of my fingernails. Believe me, I am a very hygienic person, but when it comes to paint and things like that, it tends to, for an artist who's very active, it tends to leave a little history behind. So anyway, good morning to you guys, and looks like we got a few people on. So, and this will be on my site, on my Facebook page for today. So if you take a lunch break, you can do it. Take a look at it. So let's go back to our shapes again, real quick. I'm going to do a few of them, kind of show you how cool this is. Remember we talked about a sphere in the last lesson. I'm going to lightly sketch a sphere, and I am going to give it a little bit of tone. Remember we decided on the sphere how to make it three-dimensional is you have this sort of crescent shape opposite your light source. So if our light source is here, coming from this direction, that little crescent shape is going to be opposing that, and I'm going to blend it a little with my finger. Then we have the core shadow. The core shadow is that part, remember what I said, where light isn't quite hitting from reflected light side or the main light source. You get this point on the sphere or on our shapes where it's the least amount of light that is cast upon an object in space from a light source. So now we have this sort of light colored sphere. And I'm even going to do a cast shadow on here, on the ground, let's say. Remember the cast shadow, right now we're just kind of making it up, but it's basically where the light comes down and hits the sides of your form and blocks the light. And in this case, I'm making a fairly dark shadow, and I'm letting it get a little lighter and a little softer as it gets away from the form. It gets sharper as it gets closer to where the bottom of that sphere is. And it emulates an ellipse and a shape, an ellipse, which we also talked about, which is a shape that's reminiscent of a circle in perspective, not necessarily a sphere, but a circle in perspective, which is what would happen with the light coming down. Now on the light side, all I'm going to do is put a little highlight here. I could go so far as to give it a light tone, but we're using our tone paper as a mid-tone. So your highlight would strike right about here. I like to, when I make a highlight, I like to kind of go in a little circle so that I can kind of fade that. Now a highlight is going to be different depending on your surface. If you make a softer highlight like this, what it says is that this material is not totally shiny like glass, for example. If this were made out of glass or another really hard material, that's the sharper your highlight is going to get. In other words, it would be like a perfect, strange shape, like maybe like that, or it often will pick up something in the room, a piece of the light source or something, and will emulate it there. But I'm making this just a little bit soft, saying that this is sort of maybe the texture of fired clay ceramic that has not been glazed yet, perhaps. So another thing you can do when you get these tone papers too, and some artists will do, and you'll see on their work, is they'll take and they'll say, hey, I want this side over here to show up a little bit more. I'm going to take my pastel, my lighter color. I want that edge to show up. And you'll see an artist when they're working on something use a technique where you let that faded edge show up by the fact that you're putting a glow of light behind it. It's not necessarily representing reality. There may be a glow behind an object because the light is also striking a wall or another object behind it. But artists use this technique to make an edge pop out. And it's valid. It's a valid thing in art, realism and non-realism. You know, I also wanted to add the fact that what I'm doing is somewhat representative of what we would call theory of realism, realistic light and realistic forms. It doesn't mean that stylized or work that is, artists that choose to purposely make their work more flat and stylized, Picasso-esque. This doesn't mean that that's not less valid than this sort of thinking. What I'm kind of teaching you is more realistic concepts of light on form and things like that. You can go back if you want and harden up your edges a little bit. Remember what we did? We let the line work on the light side of our objects get a little bit lighter and softer, and the dark side we picked it up. That's also a technique in line to kind of make your object pop. Crisper shadows, closer it is to the object, and then it kind of will soften up generally. So there we did a sphere on a paper bag. I'm going to do the same thing with let's see, what should we do? Should I do how about let's do I can't even think of what I'm talking about. Let's say we're doing a cylinder. You can lightly sketch it with either one, dark or light, because you're going to kind of go over it anyway. But let's just take the cylinder again. Remember, the cylinder is made up of two ellipses. One where you can see if you're looking down on it, down on the cylinder, below our eye levels we talked about before. Look at the previous lessons what they talk about eye level. We're looking down on this sphere and on this cylinder, and then as we get down, you're only going to see the front side of that ellipse that you draw, whereas this one you see the top and the bottom. So remember, well, what do we have? Well, we have our core shadow, which you can't, if you want, some artists like to just lightly put the core shadow in first because that's their way of mapping out where they want the light to change from light to dark. The other thing then is to be able to, sorry, I had to make a little adjustment there, is to go in there and start toning in your dark side. Now I'm doing this with a pastel for you, called a new pastel for those of you who are just tuning in. It's just on a regular brown bag that I cut up, and I'm using a pastel called New Pastel. So there's my core shadow. There's my dark side of my cylinder. And now I go in there. This time I'm going to use this light. See, did I use this light blue last time? Yeah. As this, what'll happen too with the cylinder is you'll get a highlight along the side, kind of opposite, since we're talking about the light coming from this side. You'll get this sort of highlight that hits right just in the middle or off to the, slightly to the side of your light side of your cylinder. It'll look something like this, depending on the material. Once again, if this is real glassy hard material, this is going to get real sharp and definite. If it's a little bit softer, then you're going to have a softer highlight on there. Now, on the top, what it would be our light side, also be striking with light, but what we're going to do, this is something that some artists will do, is they'll just make the side furthest away from the light source a little bit more of what's showing the light, because it's in contrast against the dark side. And then they'll let that kind of fade off a little bit. That's just a preference, but some artists will do that on the light side of that cylinder. And then again, we could do, if we wanted to, we could cast a shadow off of a cylinder. If the light is coming down in this direction, say the rays of light, it's going to cast that shadow based on the angle of light. If the light, let's say this was a sunlight or a lamp, if it was really on an angle, it's going to make a longer shadow. If it gets closer to being right on top of the form, the shadow is going to become shorter. In a cylinder, you get the combination of the shape of the cylinder and the shape of the ellipse on the top. So the end of the shadow is going to be reflective of where the light strikes that top ellipse. Okay, and then it's basically the same thing, what we talked about before. Let's get a little bit darker shadow below. As it gets closer to the form, the darker the shadow, because the more extreme the light is being blocked off. Then the further we get away, it's going to get just a little bit lighter, and the edges of the shadow are going to become just very faint. And there we have a cylinder. We got our core shadow, we have our light source, our reflected light, and all that sort of thing. So anyway, that's a couple of little forms. We could do that same thing here and make a light side. We could do all that kind of screwing around, but I'm not going to get into that. And again, this applies to everything. Sometimes it's funny. Sometimes when you know, and every form, as I say, is made of these same shapes. And again, a lesson or two before, when I got into the basic shapes, a cone, a cylinder, a cube, they're all fundamentally parts of, or a polygon, a part of what everything's made up of. That's why it's so important to understand light theory like this, because if you understand light theory, then first of all, you can exaggerate it in real life when you're drawing from life or drawing from something you're looking at, but also, if you don't have anything in front of you except a piece of paper, you can make things up and make them have believable volume if you understand the theory of light. These are some of the most basic ones. So let's say we had, again, a weird amoebic-like shape, like this. Okay. Well, the same principles apply. We can well, we can get into casting shadows too, but I'm not going to do that. You know, basically, you can also, you know, kind of do this thing where you plan what your light and dark side is. Let's say we want to think about the light and dark side of each one of these forms. Where's the core shadow going to be? Well, it might be something like this in this weird thing. And we get in there and start to soften these a little bit. And but we still keep our same theory. Our dark side is not going to be just one flat tone. It's going to have that core shadow on it, depending on how this form turns. And don't make a core shadow that ends hard like that. You want that to be a little bit soft, because there is a little bit of transition in a more organic form like this. Then we're going to have these little highlights that would happen on the top of this thing. Maybe there'd be a highlight here. Maybe there'd be a real subtle one that goes here, and then it would get hotter here and go thinner there. This one might trail off. And this is where you just kind of start eyeballing things and seeing what it starts to do. You might go, yeah, that looks right, or no, it's not making the shape I quite want it to. And you adjust your highlights and you adjust different things until it starts to work towards what you're trying to accomplish or communicate. Drawing is just a language of communication. One of the most powerful languages you can have. I'll tell you, I've been in conferences before, both at Disney and in other places, where everyone can talk and talk and talk forever about an idea. But when you got someone who takes and draws a picture and scoots it across the table for everyone to look at, I'll tell you, there's nothing more powerful. Everyone just goes, wow. Or, you know, in some cases, oh, okay, well, no, that's not what we want to do. I know that's what we've been talking about, but now that I see it drawn, the idea sounded better than it actually is starting to look like. Why don't we do blah, 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 and change it? And the drawing gives the whole room something for everyone to look at and talk about. Powerful, powerful communication tool when you can draw. Okay, so there's some weird little studies on some forms. I'm going to do one more little thing I think you'll get a kick out of. It's, again, a little bit, okay, camera, please allow me to do this, but there we go. This is sort of a little fun thing that is got to do with the same things we're talking about, but that I bet you didn't ever really think much about. Let's say we have a droplet of water or a dewdrop on a flower petal or a surface. Let's draw that out. Let's think about what's happening to the light. Dewdrop can be just real simple shape. It's going to have its own little shadow. If the light is coming from this direction, the dewdrop is still going to have a little bit of a shadow underneath it, and we keep it super soft. And I'm going to explain why in a second. Very soft shadow. Now remember, a dewdrop, unlike a solid thing, is transparent or translucent, depending on how clear the water is. So light isn't going to completely block out that shadow. What actually starts to happen is the edges of the water, the thickness or the density of the viscosity of the water, causes a shadow, but also you get a little bit more light inside the middle of that shadow because light is passing through that dewdrop or whatever it is I want to call it. Now here's what's kind of weird. Light will come through, and there'll be a tendency, and you'll see this if you look at photographs of dewdrops or even look at one really hard yourself. The light side, instead of being lighter, like in our form studies we were just doing, will have a tendency to be very slightly darker when you look at it. And the opposite side of the dewdrop has the luminosity inside. It's not as light as the light source itself, but the water inside is going to have some, it's going to conduct light. And your highlight is on this side. You can actually do a little tiny bit of light on this side if you want, of your dewdrop. But what's happening, theoretically, is light is passing all the way through this water and landing on the other side. This is all very, very subtle. I'm giving you kind of more of the theory of how this works. And it looks something like this. You can see how that kind of looks like a dewdrop or a blob of water. Very crude. I mean, I'm doing this very, very crudely or quickly to kind of explain the theory. If you do it more carefully and you look at some reference, you'll see the theory of what I'm talking about in reality even more clearly. But that's basically what happens. That's also what happens in the human eye or in the eye of an animal. You've ever seen artists where they'll make an eyeball on a creature or an animal that they'll let's say this eye is on some sort of animal. You have the underside of the eyelid here. That's what usually happens with the eye. You actually have a little bit of the highlight of that thickness of the skin of the eyelid. Then you have, just what we talked about, if this were not a human eye but an animal eye, you have the area that's on the same side as your light source. Let's say again it's coming from this side, as your darker side. And look at this after I do this, go look at some painters who do a lot of this. Oh, that lady, I think maybe even that's famous for the big eyes paintings. God, I should know, being an artist, what her name was. But she might have done this. I'm not sure if she did this. And your highlight is on this side, opposite the light side. And that's because, again, this isn't a human eye, this is an animal eye, let's say. That's because the light is passing through the liquid and hitting the opposite side of the wall of this bubble or material inside that's part of the viscosity of the eye. The ocular fluid, should we say. But we won't get into all those technical things. Anyway, you can see how this works, this little technique. So if you're ever making something that you want to really feel like an orb full of water or jelly, it's really exactly the opposite of the other thing we did, where you have your light and dark sides that are reflective of the light source. Okay, so I got to get back to work. I've got a digital sculpture to finish and a bunch more work today. But I hope this was a fun little lesson. I'll keep them up, and I encourage you to practice. Keep doing all these little things. Experiment, because I'm going to lead all this up to doing objects and things that we can relate to. I'm going to be showing you about designing tiki mugs and carvings and everything, and how all these principles can help you think in 3D on a flat piece of paper. And my whole feeling, as I said before, is that I want you to be able to not look at a flat piece of paper ever the same anymore. It's not a flat surface. It is an atmosphere, and a window that you can step into and make magic. Okay, talk to you again soon. Thanks for joining me. Bye now.